Okay. Good morning. I believe we're live now. Good morning to everyone keeping up with us from Brazil. Good evening to those in South Africa and all of the other time zones. Welcome to the sixth panel of the sixth conference of BRICS. It is a sorry, a problem with the sound. So this is a conference that is occurring throughout this week, and it is organized by University of São Paulo Center for BRICS Studies, headed by Professor Paulo Borba Casella. I am Ana Carolina. I am a member of the study and research group, and today I will be representing it. I am very glad that we are joined here today to discuss a pillar of international cooperation that has been growing and understand how the BRICS countries have acted and how they are affected by international financing of transport infrastructure. I would like to firstly thank our speakers for their time and availability to be here with us today. Today, we're going to have the pleasure of hearing Mr. Mikatekiso Kubayi from South Africa, Mr. Edpo Covalciuk from Brazil, Mr. Valdir Bezerra, also from Brazil, and at the end, Mr. Abicalil. I also thank all of the spectators that are watching us. And if you would like to receive confirmation of your presence, please fill out the Google Forms that is indicated at the YouTube's comment section. And if throughout the panel you have any questions for the panelists, please send them in a comment and we will read them. And at the end of the panel, we will have a moment where the speakers will answer the questions. Please participate. With no further ado, we're now going to begin with Mr. Mikatekiso Kubayi's presentation. He is a researcher at the Institute for Global Dialogue associated with UNISA and a research fellow at the Institute for Pan-African Thought and Conversation at the University of Johannesburg. He has previously worked as a political advisor in Speaker's Office under Hon Max Sisulu, although his current projects focus mostly on matters of the BRICS and global finance. His research interests include power, global political economy, focus on financial architecture, and African political economy. He holds a Master of Arts, a global political economy degree from the University of Sussex, and he is a doctoral candidate in political studies at the University of Johannesburg, and with his research on the New Development Bank. He is currently working with colleagues on a book on BRICS and political economy on development finance in Africa, and is a member of the South African Association of Political Studies. Mr. Kubayi, you may please begin your speech.
Thank you so much, Ms. Britto. Thank you so much, colleagues, and thank you so much to participants and everyone generally interested in the conversation that we're having today. This is a very important conversation. It's a conversation about finance. May I share my screen, please?
Yes.
It's a conversation, about international financing and transport, infrastructure, a theme. And my angle is, on cooperation, in achieving development, finance goals. Now, this is a BRICS conference, and one felt one must stick to the purpose of BRICS, what the BRICS essentially how to achieve and continue to do.
Ontem nós falamos aqui sobre manter a mente ativa. Aí eu manteve a sua.
I was tempted, you can imagine, as a researcher, I was tempted to, throw in, a plethora of, statistics. But then I remembered that we've got colleagues, from the NDB, and the likes. They'll come and explain to us exactly what the NDB is doing. But, I thought, for the following discussion, I'll just outline a few basic objectives of my conversation. To argue for the centrality of everyday human development in discourse on the development, especially development financing such as transport infrastructure. There's a typo here. To argue that silo approach to development financing, let me see, I don't see everything on my screen. That would be much better. To argue that silo approach to development financing will be slow to achieve the outcomes that BRICS desired, if at all. To argue that the approach by the NDB to seek collaborations is a correct common sense approach. That the BRICS bloc and the NDB should seek and demonstrate relevance beyond the bloc. Now, it's important, whenever we speak about development, to first, have, a common understanding, of exactly what that development actually is, how to define, development. Now, I know it's an elusive, a definition. There are a myriad of, definitions, for development. There is not, a single definition of development. And development theory does not, expand, well, does not, agree, on a single definition, of development. But this is what I borrow from a couple of sources, to explain what, I think would be a relevant, useful definition of development for the purposes of investment spending and investment finance. The Cambridge Dictionary, for instance, would say development is the process in which someone or something grows, or changes and becomes more advanced. Now, obviously, in the context of the developing South, the global South, the global South was development. It wants to move to, from underdevelopment or less developed to advanced, like any other economy, like any other region of the world. I borrow again, a quotation from a dissertation this time, and a master's dissertation by a student in 2005. I thought this was, quite apt and interesting. Mr. Diale. Quote, development is a broad concept that entails social, economic, political, and human development. Human development constitutes the foundation on which the first three concepts are based. Now, this is absolutely vital. If we're going to talk about transport, infrastructure, what transport are we talking about? Are we talking about ports? Are we talking about economic, infrastructure, where transport is concerned? Are we talking about social infrastructure where transport is concerned? And how does that play, what role does it play in, the actual everyday lived experience, the everyday reality of human beings in actual human spaces where they live, and so I thought this definition, is actually quite apt, for what it is that we're trying to do as BRICS in the context of development. What is transport infrastructure? Rail, roads, ports, air transport, airports, bus stations, trains, and so on, bridges, you name it. Different categories of transport, including the equipment, trains themselves, buses, themselves, trucks, cars, motor vehicles. In these days, electric motor vehicles. In fact, we can even expand, further and start talking about manufacturing, of electric vehicles. And so on, and the industry and the politics, associated with that. Why transport infrastructure? The relevance of transport infrastructure, I thought, maybe look at, a simple description, from the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe, where it says, United Nations, transport is vital to the well-functioning of economic activities and a key to ensuring social well-being and cohesion of populations. Transport ensures everyday mobility of people and is crucial to the production and distribution of goods. Adequate infrastructure is a fundamental precondition for transport systems. Right. Now, That's a very, broad, description, of what, transport actually is. You can talk about transport, that facilitates immigration, for instance, and a whole host. But, I think this is an apt, a description, of, the importance and relevance of transport, and therefore the need to finance transport. Go further. The United Nations Agenda 2030, among other things, identifies with serious clarity the role of development in preventing violent extremism, poverty reduction, inequalities, reduction, and the general attainment of higher HDI scores, Human Development Index scores, across all economies. Now, this is very important to simply argue the centrality, of a human development, when, thinking about, transport infrastructure, financing any infrastructure, for that matter, is alluded in the first slide. Now, where do we get this financing from? What do we do? How to approach it? Right? Now, there are two ways. I mean, we often talk about, capital markets. We often talk about, private firms, being, the major funders and major sources of finance, funding, for infrastructure. In fact, for all manner of investments, right? But there's many different, schools of thought, about, how to approach, development finance, for instance. Some believe, it ought to be led by the state, while others, prefer, a market-driven, a strictly market-driven, approach, to investment finance, and so on. Now, I am of the view, that, it is important for states, to play a major role, a key role, in fact, in stimulating development. Yeah, not a sole role, but a significant role, a major role, in achieving development and sourcing development finance, because the state knows exactly where its people are, exactly what its people want, exactly because they vote for it. Now, I look at the role of DFIs, for instance, as one vehicle, that states, then, can use, to pursue the issue of development finance, particularly of infrastructure. And the role of development finance, institutions, are old, so to speak. And development of a development or a post-Cold War, not post-World War II, sorry, but development as a concept. Developing, finance institutions are historically state-funded, finance institutions established to fund development projects, in particular infrastructure projects that require longer-term financing than traditional banks, would normally provide. These institutions have been important development partners and agencies to countries in the post-World War II period. Each BRICS country, has such a DFI. BRICS launched its own DFI in 2014, the New Development Bank. Now, the New Development Bank, why, was it, launched, to begin with? The BRICS blog in 2013 discussed the idea of a development finance institution, as well as a contingent reserve arrangement as a supplementary measure to the global financial architecture. Now, there's a lot of literature, of literature, particularly in the Western world, where BRICS is often, and the NDB are often, said to be, an attempt, by a couple of countries to essentially replace, the existing architecture, and not what BRICS says it is, and that is, reform, and development agenda, reform of, global governance and development. Now, the BRICS bloc, the NDB was launched in 2014 and became operational in 2016. This was necessitated by the very theme of today, development finance, where developing economies historically have struggled to acquire requisite levels of development finance they need for their development. E.g., according to the African Development Bank, for instance, Africa has a funding gap of over 180 billion per annum. Now, where is this money going to come from? Ordinarily, individual states, do not have, the ready available cash, to be able to, invest, in such, infrastructure ambitions. We all know, would all be aware of the 15 flagship projects of the African Union, for instance, that require funding, and transport is a major one, particularly for the Africa Continental Free Trade Area and so on. Developing economies also needed and continue to need financing on terms that encourage development rather than setting them up in debt traps. IMF, World Bank, and other mostly Western private finance firms would know about this. In fact, structural adjustment policies, particularly in the 80s, are very famous in the developing world, especially the global south, for their destructive outcomes. Now, we can have a long discussion, about, this particular point. But it is, something that is, of, particular importance historically to that, this region of the world. The NDB was also established as an expression of the will of the BRICS bloc to intervene more meaningfully in the global financial and economic governance, particularly since the catastrophe of the 2008 global financial crisis. Of course, there's also a history, to that, how the BRICS finance ministers, got together and so on. And this, by the way, is deliberately, separating the BRICS bloc, from Mr. Jim O'Neill's, conception, of the bloc, earlier on. He excludes, certain elements, that today make the BRICS, actually as solid and as strong as it is. NDB approaches with partnerships with local DFIs. The NDB does not have a limitless reserve of funds. It cannot, at present be compared to the gargantuan size of the World Bank and the IMF. In fact, successive BRICS, summit declarations have without ambiguity communicated the intentions, of the bloc and NDB, not as a replacement, but as an additional instrument through which perhaps greater equity in global financial and economic governance involvement. As envisioned, by NDB's articles, this I borrow from the NDB website itself, this description, of the NDB's approach. As envisioned by the NDB's articles of agreement, the bank seeks to complement the efforts of multilateral and regional financial institutions to support global growth and development. NDB places a strong emphasis on building and implementing effective partnerships as promoted by SDG 17 on partnerships for the goals to accelerate member countries' endeavors dedicated to sustainable development. Now, it's very clear from the onset, right? Needless to say that, the NDB itself is fairly young. It's, how old is it now? About 14, 15 years old or so, somewhere there. It is a young, institution and would not, obviously have, an institution with now, I think about 8 members or so, originally 5. But it's a young institution that does not have, a limitless, a pool, of funds, from which to access for its purposes. But it's growing. It's showing, that resilience, that, purposive effort, to grow, to expand, and to reach out further, and further. The establishment of the regional centers, in Brazil, in Russia, in South Africa, is, an important step in the correct direction. looking at opportunities for finance projects in those respective regions and so on, and not only limited to necessarily the BRICS bloc itself. The NDB has MOUs for partnerships with local DFIs in China, Agriculture Development Bank, Export-Import Bank, China Development Bank, Brazil Development Bank, and South Africa Development Bank of Southern Africa, DBSA, and India as well is in the process of establishing a new development finance institution. Now, I mentioned this particularly, not because India has never had a DFI. In fact, it has had several, but 4 of them previously that were later converted or turned into private banking institutions and so on. And there's of course a history behind that and the reason that actually happened. It also has several MOUs with multilateral financing institutions, including the World Bank Group. The NDB seeks to ensure sustainable relevance beyond the BRICS as well. Financing syndication. Now, still on the effort to build collaborations, and to pull institutions together to build partnerships, to pull resources together for this monumental effort, of achieving development through, infrastructure, finance and so on, infrastructure provision and so on. And there's some, interesting developments in the world of finance, such as, the network for greening financial system, the sustainable banking network, clearly indicating, the relevance of the role of collaboration, the relevance, of partnering, rather than going it alone, in order to, access a greater pool, of funding resources and so on. And this is a big, development in the world. In fact, considering what I stated earlier, examples such as Africa's infrastructure funding gap, of over $180 billion a year, for instance. The existence of such networks, is founded on the fact that the collective can and will achieve greater outcomes for humanity than the silos. E.g., the African Development Bank speaks of a gas belt running down West Africa to Southern Africa, but needs investment in the gas economy that includes infrastructure to transport this energy source to market. Infrastructure such as pipelines, such an undertaking requires the cooperation and collaboration of multiple partners and funders from the collective of economies of this gas belt, as well as external partners. BRICS and the NDB have a role to lead in this effort of promoting collaborations to pool resources for investments in development infrastructure, beginning with BRICS collaborations. Now, my final slide, in this conversation. Development objectives, would include development in BRICS is about improving the human condition, the everyday reality of the more than a third of the global population, about 41.5% or so. The African population is expected to hit 2.5 billion in 2050. What will be the BRICS population at that point, right? In 2015, about 28 years from now? Surely it will be quite a sizable population. And this population needs bridges, it needs trains, it needs whatever vehicles, means and modes of transport. It needs goods to reach them. It needs to reach goods. It needs to reach foods. It needs to transport food, and so on and so forth. How and where will the money come from? To develop such infrastructure to cater for such a large growing population, for instance, outside of collaborations. Investment in transport infrastructure and other capital projects needs to emphasize and insist on localization of production and access to value chains. I mean, this, is a simple argument, really, that, you want to, this population that is growing, you want to develop jobs, you want to give, a broader meaning to development. You want, skills to improve. You want self-sufficiency to improve. You want, dignity and confidence, to improve. You want the overall, social reality, of populations in the BRICS economies and beyond, in the general South, in the main, to improve. And to do that, you need, a serious consideration for the real economy. Invest, in actual production, so that people can get jobs, so that people can develop things, so that people can innovate, and assist, to organize and provide access, to value chains, to markets, and so on and so forth. You're not going to get that, without such attention to the real economy. You're not going to get it. It's fine. We can talk about, building a bridge here, building a bridge there, but that is well and good, but, to develop, particularly in this global capitalist economy, you need access to markets. You need to produce things. You need to, access, to value chains. You need particularly, value chains that will, offer opportunities for value-added, goods, to reach markets, and so on. And this is very important. And in fact, some, tend to talk about regionalism, and regionalization of value chains, for instance, as one of, the mechanisms to absorb, shock, from, global turmoil, and so on. Such as, with the case of COVID-19 pandemic, where we've seen the global South suffering, without sufficient capacity to produce, to manufacture vaccines, for instance. I mean, such infrastructure is needed, and localization is very important. I mean, it's a perfect example of that. They need to localize, not to exclude others, but, to provide that, safety net, to provide that confidence, for economies, to provide that confidence for societies, that they too, can actually have, a more meaningful experience, a more meaningful reality, than is currently, being experienced. I mean, development includes the development of social, economic, and political infrastructure for a fuller human development experience. Emphasis on localization is important to provide employment and other development opportunities, of this fast-growing population, and develop self-sufficiency. This is my, simple, contribution to the conversation. Really to, locate transport infrastructure, not, as a single entity on its own somewhere, as an island, but rather as, part of a major, much bigger, development, effort, right? For a purpose, to facilitate, job creation, to facilitate, access to healthcare even. You need transport to transport equipment. You need transport to transport healthcare workers. You need transport to transport patients, and so on and so forth. So it's actually very central, to the overall, collective efforts, to improve the development, in actual human spaces, where they experience, their everyday lives. Yes, this is, essentially my contribution for the moment. I look forward to discussions further. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kubayi, for your contribution. I think we all learned a lot, especially about how you brought this human aspect, associating the transport infrastructure with the need to localize. And it is not a separate infrastructure. It is something that should reflect those places' needs and those people's needs in order to develop. So thank you very much for your contribution. Now we're going to go on with Mr. Edpo Covalciuk. He is a Brazilian engineer with experience in the rail sector, and by the Deutsche Bahn Academy, he is internationally certified in management and rail and metro systems. He possesses an MBA in project management and is a specialist in investment analysis. Today, he serves the World Bank and Infrastructure Transport Practice of South Asia and Latin America's region. In addition to the technical background, he has a strong financial expertise and particularly in project finance. Mr. Covalciuk, you may now begin your presentation, please.
Thank you, Anna. Let me start by greeting my colleagues here, the discussants that are sharing this virtual table. Just give me a second. Let me try to share my screen. So yeah, hopefully you all can see my screen, right?
Yes, we can.
Okay, thank you. So I'll be spending the next 50 minutes trying to walk you through the role of the World Bank in leading this climate finance agenda, and of course, focusing on transport that is central for the development agenda, as our colleague has just introduced us. So let me start by presenting the World Bank as a group. So the World Bank is formed by 5 agencies, 5 institutions. The most famous institution is IBRD, the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, but we also have the International Development Association, IDA, and these 2 first institutions deal specifically with governments. On the private sector part, we have IFC and MIGA. IFC stands for International Finance Corporation, and MIGA is the Multilateral Investment Guarantee Agents. They are the World Bank arms and length institution to work with the private sector on providing financial solutions and guarantees to private projects related to public services. And finally, we have the International Center for Settlement and Investment Disputes, which is basically a tribunal arbitration board. So the World Bank as a group has 2 main objectives that we call twin goals. And the first is to end extreme poverty, and the second is to promote shared prosperity. And when we look to the unfolding impacts of climate change, there's a straight correlation to the World Bank twin goals. First, because climate change could push up to 130 million people into the poverty line over the next 10 years, which goes exactly in the opposite direction of our goals. And secondly, because the 74 poorest countries in the world are responsible for less than 1/10 of the total global greenhouse gas emissions, but in contrast, they have been hardest hit by climate change disasters. And these disasters directly affect the poorest and the most vulnerable people. So it's impossible to achieve our twin goals without leading and tackling the climate change agenda. So only in the last decade, the number of natural disasters in these countries increased 80-folds. And the bottom line here is that we basically have, in one side, the developed countries that are the largest contributors in terms of emission. And on the other side, we have the underdeveloped countries that aspire to become a developed country in the near future. But the thing is that if the underdeveloped country follow the same path, we'll have a perfect storm very shortly. So the climate change require a global cooperation, a cooperation of the global community in a way that the developed countries may not only support, but also finance the development of the rest of the world in a sustainable track. Let me move to the next slide. So this slide just to put into perspective the current global emission landscape, and we can quickly recognize how development and emissions go hand in hand here. Narrowing our attention to the BRICS, there's China as the second largest emitter. But then we have Brazil, India, and Russia somewhere in the halfway. They are not the largest contributors, especially considering the proportion of their territorial extensions, but they are far from being at the bottom also. And finally, we have Africa, which stands out clearly. They have been suffering a lot with climate change, but they basically doesn't contribute too much to the problem in terms of emission. And as we could see in the first slide, the biggest portfolio of the World Bank investment goes towards Africa, mainly in terms of adaptation and resilience. So recently, the World Bank has launched this climate change action plan with the purpose of transitioning from investing in green projects to greening entire economies. It has many pillars, but I brought here just 3 of them that I consider the most important one. The first pillar is the Country Climate and Development Reports, what we call CCDRs. Most of our member countries don't have a clue from where to start when tackling the climate change. They recognize it. They are willing to move this agenda forward, but they need help. They clearly need help. So we are producing these CCDRs, and these reports are country and sector-wide. So we have one report for each country, and each report has different sectors and subsectors. And we will make it available for countries, investors, and the global community to help them taking informed decisions, setting priorities in terms of investments, policy actions, and so on. So CCDRs will be rolled out completely free of charge and should be shortly available on the World Bank website. The second pillar, we have a target to commit at least 35% of our portfolio towards climate agenda. But most importantly here is that our projects should be Paris aligned. So we are not just investing in the climate agenda, but we are investing in projects that contribute to the Paris Agreement. And in practice, it means that we are not financing projects that contributes to emissions. The classical example here is the coal power plants, and in some cases, expansion of highways. There are many shades of grays here when we talk about roads and highways. Of course, the bank is still finance road safety. The bank is still finance rural connectivity and rural roads, but we definitely want to phase out the investments in private vehicles where possible. And the last pillar that's also very important is bringing the private sector to finance this agenda. So I think we all agree that public sector cannot afford financing this agenda. And it's not a matter of budget, it's also a matter of pace. The public sector simply doesn't move fast enough. So most of our underdeveloped countries, they do not have investment rating, and so they are not able to access capital private markets. Of course, it happens for a reason. Or for a set of reasons. In one hand, there is this upstream environment. And here I'm talking about having clear sectoral regulations, political stability, fiscal stability, conflict resolution mechanisms, and so on. This upstream environment is crucial to attract private investments and financing. And on the other hand, we have the projects itself. So, I mean, the quality of it. So we have to ensure that countries are producing bankable projects and technically strong projects. In addition to that, the bank offers many kinds of guarantees that are instruments to backstop contractual obligations and viability gap fund assumed by the governments in PPPs. And these are powerful instruments because they bring the World Bank AAA, which the maximum investment grades, into the project, into the country, and it helps to leverage private finance at a much better terms and conditions. So we have two good examples here, one in Brazil and one in India. Brazil has a very good tradition in PPPs at subnational levels, but at the federal level, we still don't have a successful PPP. And among other reasons, this is because we don't have a guarantee structure mechanism at federal level to support and to backstop these PPPs. But the thing is that the existing accounting framework in Brazil does not allow for this kind of guarantees, this World Bank or multilateral guarantees. And because of that, we cannot unlock a very potential market for infrastructure financing in Brazil. And on the other side, we have India. India has a huge program to introduce e-buses, electric buses in the system, and they are putting together the biggest bidding process for electric buses, 50,000 electric buses, the biggest bidding process in the world. But they don't have providers because they also lack sources of financing. So we are putting together a payment structure mechanism in India to allow private sector to come in and to provide some backstop and first risk loss mechanisms to bring in more financing and scale up the adoption of these buses there. But then how the transport sector fits into this broad strategy? First, because transport is at the center of the development agenda. So transport provides accessibility to jobs, education, and opportunities. Transport is also crucial for domestic logistics and global supply chains. It's also important for the global food security. And second, because transport is part of the problem. And you can only be part of the solution if you are part of the problem. So emissions from transport have more than doubled over the last 15 years. Today, transport is the second largest contributor to climate change. And in the business as usual scenario, emissions from transport will increase faster than any other sector up to 2050. And emissions in developing countries, especially in developing countries, are increasing pretty fast. We can see in the top right graph here how the number of vehicles in low and middle income countries are expected to skyrocket, while developed countries have reached a stabilization point. And also developed countries are also expected to lead the introduction of electric vehicles as opposed to underdeveloped countries, and they are also provided with a great mass transport system such as metro, commuter rail, regional rail, and so on. So we can grasp from this graph that the biggest problem moving forward is exactly the low and middle income countries. They aspire to become a developed country, and in this way to become a developed country, they can more than double the emissions from the transport sector. And the second graph shows us two alternative pathways in terms of transport emission. In blue, we see the business as usual scenario and the tendency of emission from this scenario. And in yellow, we see the low carbon pathway that considers the implementation of measures, investments needs, and so on. So this is my last slide. The bank invests in a broad array of subsectors into the transport. We invest in electric buses, in BRTs, in roads, and so on. But I especially want to highlight here the rail program in India, Brazil, and China. So in India, we are financing the dedicated freight corridors. India has a very extensive rail network. It's the fourth rail networks in terms of volume in the world, but they are completely over capacity. They are operating over capacity. So the government of India decided some years ago to implement dedicated freight corridors in what we call the Golden Quadrilateral. These are the most intense operated corridors in India. It connects Delhi to Kolkata, Kolkata to Chennai, Chennai to Mumbai, Mumbai to Delhi. The first two corridors under implementation are Delhi to Mumbai, what we call Western Dedicated Freight Corridor, It has been financed by JICA, the Japan Agents for Development. And the second one from Delhi to Kolkata has been financed by the World Bank. So here is a good example on how we can engage with the private sector along with the World Bank financing. So we have the World Bank, we have MEGA guarantee to bring in private financing, and we also have one stretch that will be delivered through PPPs. The second is the agenda in Brazil. So the bank was responsible for the modernization and digitization of the commuter rail services in the whole country, but especially in São Paulo, the bank has supported this state to modernize its system. So we can see in the first picture how it was 15, 20 years ago and how it's now. So São Paulo has a very, very good commuter rail system and network, thanks to the World Bank and other partners, of course. And the last example is in China. So China has an extensive high-speed rail network to become the most extensive high-speed network in the world. And it was also supported by the World Bank. The image you are seeing here is a report that we produced based on our experience with China. So it's available for download free at our website. So thank you, Ana. Thank you, Valdir. Thank you, discussants. I'm finishing here.
Thank you very much, Edpo, for your contributions. I think we all learned a lot, especially about how specifically the World Bank works. I really like the part where you talked about it being a connector between investors and the initiatives that focus on sustainable transportation, because if it is, as you said, it is a part of the problem, so it can and it should be a part of the solution. And now we're going to go forward with Mr. Valdir Bezerra's presentation. He has a master's degree in international relations by the University of St. Petersburg. He is a member of NUPRI Geasia, USP's International Relations Research Group on matters concerning Asia, and he is also a part of USP's Center for BRICS Studies. Among the articles that he has published, recurring themes are those about Brazil's foreign policy and the Russian Federation's domestic and external policies. Mr. Bezerra, thank you for your presence, and we would very much like to hear your thoughts on the matter. You may please begin your presentation.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Ana Britto, for the mediation of this discussion table. I would like also to thank the participation of all my colleagues here today. So I will take a transitory approach to my speech that will handle some of the issues that were discussed previously to me and after me. So I will start by sharing my screen. I hope everybody sees the presentation.
Yes, we can see it now.
Everybody can see now the first screen?
Yeah.
So I hope everybody sees now the first screen of the presentation. So it is called the Transition to NDB, Political Approaches of the Bank Towards Investments. I am Master in International Relations by St. Petersburg State University, and most of what I'm going to say is based on an article that I published in the BRICS Journal of Economics by the end of 2020. First of all, I would like to mention something about the new development bank that was also discussed briefly in the presentation of Mikatekiso in the our first speaker. First of all, I would like to emphasize the fact that the new development bank does not necessarily mean a rival institution to the World Bank or the IMF. This is something that the BRICS countries also make sure to get quite clear to the international community, because this bank, in fact, came to complement the efforts that were already made or already being made by the World Bank in terms of financing. The bank, in fact, has a very peculiar characteristic, which is its non-Western character. So if we can say something curious about the New Development Bank, is that it was one of the first financial or global financial institutions that are are headed by non-Western states. Of course, that we can have discussions about the role of Brazil in here, because Brazil has inherited some of the Western institutions, but I mean in terms of civilizations represented by this bank, we have mostly non-Western civilizations represented in them. The bank is a materialization in the legal and economic field of relevant political approximation between these countries. It was the institutionalization of BRICS, if we can put it this way, even though all these countries have very big differences, cultural, social, and political differences among themselves. So it was really a very good and very emblematic achievement of the BRICS group. So what are some of the principles that are upheld by the bank in which it tries to present a different approach, or maybe some aspects of differentiation in regards to other institutions of global governance, of global financial governance? First of all, it has some relation to its non-hierarchical character. This cooperation that happens within the New Development Bank have some South-South framework embedded in them, enough to say that we have 3 countries or 4 countries that are considered to be part of this so-called Global South. So we have Brazil, India, South Africa, and China. Russia is a debatable factor, but in fact, it has this character to the New Development Bank, a non-hierarchical approach to investments, non-conditionality and non-interference approach. So the borrows that the bank operate, the lendings, in fact, that the bank operates does not necessarily comes together with conditionalities, be it political, be it social, be it of any other nature. So this is a different approach when it comes to comparisons with the International Monetary Fund, for instance, and also to a certain extent to what the World Bank also does. Another thing that happens is it presents a tailored model or a more specific approach to its lendings instead of a one-size-fits-all formula. So the New Development Bank does not come necessarily with a model that is applicable to all countries and all situations in terms of its financing or its projects. So it is also a very interesting factor that is related to this bank. So borrowers and the bank itself stand on the same level of participation in its projects. And also, one of the very interesting aspects of the Development Bank that is not present in other institutions, in the World Bank, for instance, or in the International Monetary Fund, the so-called Bretton Woods institutions that were funded after the Second World War, is that all members of BRICS have equal voting shares, and they have equal weight on the decisions of the bank, since all of its participants hold 20% of the voting in this institution, which is also something not common in other institutions of global governance. So this is a saying by the New Development Bank itself. So the bank was expected to have an influence on international financial architecture and global practices by being a fundamentally new kind of development institution based on mutual respect and reflecting the evolution of the world economy. In recent case, an evolution in which emerging countries are playing a more prominent role since at least the end of the 1990s and also the beginning of the 2000s, when they start to voice for bigger participation in global economic decision making. The bank so far has more than 79 projects approved. Around $27 billion were used to finance projects in all areas, ranging from clean energy, transportation, infrastructure, healthcare, and others, and many other spheres of social life and political life. And among these 79 projects, 18 were related to transportation. It represents some 22% of all the projects approved by the bank up until this point. Of course, there are other projects that are now being studied for approval, but the ones that were already approved represent 22% for transport alone, and 20% of the total financing that the bank has used since its beginning in 2015. Well, the geographical concentration, when we come to discuss international financing or the new development bank financing in transportation, is as I have set in this screen. So we have 6 projects in China, and it is 32%, represents 32% of the bank's total, 22% when we see the financial aspect of what was attributed to that country alone. In Russia, we have 3 projects that were approved, representing 13% of all the financing resources that the bank has spent on transportation. Among the 5 members of BRICS, India has 5 projects, also significant number, 27% of the total number of projects that the bank approved. South Africa, 3 projects, and Brazil has had 1 project approved with a number of $300 million, and it is related to the project called the North Region Transportation Infrastructure Improvement Project that has its main goal is to help drain Vale do Rio Doce's company's production of iron ore to Brazil's national ports and also other logistical points inside the country. We see Brazil as a country of continental size, and of course that logistics is one thing that Brazil has to deal with, not only to increase its economy, but also to enhance the possibilities of being a more prominent player in Latin America and in the world in general. So with that, I would like to finish my presentation. It was more of an overall presentation about some aspects related to the new development bank. I also touched upon some of the items and some of the discussions that were brought upon by other participants previously to me. And I give the word to Ana Britto again. I would like to thank you, the University of São Paulo, for this opportunity for being a speaker in the 6th BRICS conference. Thank you.
Thank you, Valdir. We thank you very much for your participation. I think we all learned a lot about NDB and how the fact that it is fundamentally a new kind of development infrastructure because of the developing countries' protagonism in it, how this novelty appears in the format, and the fact that it is a non-hierarchy. It does not have such a established hierarchy in its approach. So thank you very much. Now we're going to go on with Mr. Marcos Abicalil's participation. He is a principal professional on NDB, America's regional office, and has over 30 years of professional experience on urban development, water, sanitation, and infrastructure. He has also worked in the World Bank on the programs regarding water and sanitation in Latin America, in projects in Brazil, Latin American countries, Africa, and Asia. He has also participated in joint efforts with the IFC in financing and modeling of participations for the private sector. In the past, Mr. Abicalil has also worked as a senior assessor for AESB and coordinated the sanitation sector program for modernization. He has a bachelor's degree in architecture and urbanism from the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. Mr. Abicalil, we would really like to hear your contributions on the theme, and you may begin your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you, everybody, for this discussion, for the São Paulo University and the BRICS institution for the invitation for us to participate in that very important discussion that now goes to the BRICS, but in the future goes beyond the BRICS towards a broader range of emerging countries and emerging economies. And I prepared the presentation, but I think that part of I prepared was already covered by the presentation of Mr. Valdir and Mr. Kubayi, for whom I thanks for bringing the knowledge, the overall knowledge of the World Bank and for the NDB as well as for the BRICS agenda, how NDB is embedded in the BRICS agenda. And also thank you, Mr. Edpo from the World Bank to bring this overall picture of the relation between transport sector, this broad transport sector, and the impacts on climate change and the goals that the world is agreeing based on the Paris Agreement and also on the national determined contributions for every country on zero emissions by the year 2050. I start my presentation. I also prepared a video for you, but I think the video now should not be presented because you have already a good overview of the NDB based on the previous presentation that my colleagues did before. I just will share my screen with you. Are you seeing the screen?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, so I'm not going to start from the beginning, as I mentioned before, because most of what was there was to present NDB to everybody, but like just to highlight some issues that were brought by my previous colleagues on the NDB capital structure and governance. So this is a unique model. So the BRICS, I think, is the unique block of countries, a group of countries that is not are only working together in the international development agenda, but they create the bank to address the main challenges those countries face. And between the challenge that those countries face is sustainable infrastructure. So the NDB has this focus on financing the BRICS economies as well as expansion of the bank towards developing countries, focusing on sustainable infrastructure. And this is based on, again, a unique model based on equality of the founder countries. So they have the same, they share the same capital structure, the same right, the same governance. And as was also mentioned before by Mr. Valdir, we have no prescription of policies, no restrictions. We are mostly based on country systems as well as on country demands. So this is a very important feature of the bank, and you have to accommodate the goals of the bank together with the demands of the countries and the particular stage in which country is in the development agenda as well as the climate change agenda and on the emissions agenda. When Mr. Edpo presented the overall picture of global emissions and also mentioned the importance of emerging economies in the global emissions in the future, we also have to think that the transition for every country is not be the same. Every country you have a different path based, not only the current emissions, the current trend for development, but also the conditions that those countries have to move towards net zero emissions in the year 2050. So the banks here is able to provide support to each country, each member country, on developing this infrastructure based on the own country goals to face climate change on emissions as well as on adaptation and on resilience. And for that, the bank has a strategy, a recent strategy approved by the board of governors earlier this year. You can see this a frame of this strategy of the bank here. And what's the most important thing here? We have building blocks in which we are some very key aspects based on the country demands, on criticality of the SDGs, also the Sustainable Development Agenda, work together towards innovation, work together with other countries, as correctly mentioned by Mr. Kubayi on this presentation, this integrated or coordinated work between development banks at the global and local environment. But we are, in our strategy, we are also eager to mobilize resources to, as was mentioned by Mr. Edpo, public sector will not be able to finance all the needs of every country, so private sector is going to be a very important partner for this challenge. So we have to work together, private sector, to work together with other banks to increase or to leverage impact. We also have to address specific aspects of every country. One of the very important, I'm going to mention that later on, is local currency financing, which is still a challenge for us. But looking at a project specifically, being more pragmatic, the bank will, based on very cross-cutting considerations of climate change and resilience, of integrating technology and innovation into infrastructure solutions, as well as inclusiveness. So infrastructure has a very key role to reduce inequalities and poverty in every country. I'd like also to raise one of the World Bank papers in Brazil issued in 2017. The World Bank was saying that the Brazil challenge for reducing poverty and sustainable development should be based on very core aspects. One is human capital and second is infrastructure. This is also commonplace for other countries. And the bank is also based on this cross-cutting consideration of inclusiveness. And that should be also applied to the specific sectors. So one sector is clean energy efficiency. The second one is transport infrastructure. And transport here, I'm going to discuss about several modalities of transportation, freight and urban mobility, water and sanitation, environmental protection, social infrastructure. It's also a very key aspect for inclusiveness, and digital infrastructure. We could be combined with any other sector that we finance. The products we have, so for you all to have an idea that we are, as mentioned before, we are a very, very young bank compared to the World Bank created in 1945 after the Second World War in Bretton Woods, which is more than about 70 years of working around the world. NDB is the youngest institution in that environment of the multilateral development banks. We are just 6 years old since we started operation. The creation was decided in 2014 in Brazil, in Fortaleza, and the first operation was in 2016. And also we start decentralizing our activities by creating regional office. And the Brazil regional office was created just 3 years ago in 2019. So this is a very young institution. It's an institution that's being built by practice, by cooperation between the member countries, together with cooperation with other financial partners. So we are still developing our set of products. The main product that we can provide is financing through loans, long-term financing. We can finance to public sector with sovereign guarantees. We can finance emergency loans. We did a very important program for the COVID pandemic. We opened $10 billion program for the countries, addressing social and health needs together with economic recovery. And we also have a technical support, so a small project preparation fund that can provide grants to support clients in addressing project challenges. But we also work together with private sector, differently from the World Bank, which has different arms for public and private sectors. NDB is a unique institution that also can work with private sector. Mr. Valdir mentioned here a project to finance transportation and logistics infrastructure in the northern part of Brazil. It's a private operation without sovereign guarantees, a fully private operation that we can finance. So we can finance corporate and project finance loans. We can provide guarantees. We also have already participation in equity funds, which also have investment in transportation in Brazil. We can finance national institutions. We have a very important cooperation with BNDES here in Brazil, with the BSCA in South Africa, in Russia, also with these development banks. And we're now starting this dialogue with India, also to working with national banks, either public or private banks, either commercial or development banks, as a way to leverage our impact, but also to amplify our reach, creating more, being able to provide support to smaller clients that we would not be able to do directly, but we can do it through development local banks, as well as international organizations. We just approved a loan with FONPLATA. It's FONPLATA's development agency of the Plata Rivers countries in Latin America. We just agreed with them, and we are going to provide a loan so they can also finance smaller municipalities in Brazil, and later on also in Uruguay, as soon as Uruguay confirms his membership to the bank. So these are a broad of the products we have that can provide a lower interest rate compared to the market conditions. The bank has a very good financial strength. We are rated by the global rating agency from AA to AAA. For a young institution with a small number of countries, it's a very good rating that can allow us to provide longer term and cheaper loans to every client that we have. For instance, for the public sector in Brazil or South Africa, we are cost of financing is lower than the local treasuries cost of financing in external and foreign currency. The countries benefit from the high rating the bank has. The bank has a higher rating than any of the individual member country, and the country benefits from these financial conditions through longer term and cheaper loans. So there's is also can do for both sovereign and non-sovereign parts, for public and for private sector. These are specific for sovereign institutions that we can do. So we are demand driven. So we have no line of credits for sectors except on the emergency. In emergency COVID was a very particular situation. In the bank created a program for COVID with $10 billion for the 5 member countries at the time. But apart from the emergency, we have no credit line. We can finance any sustainable infrastructure based on demand of the municipality, of a state, of a country, of a state-owned company or a private company or a project. So we are able to do that based on the demand, and you can tailor the solution and the financial conditions for private sector or for overall financial conditions for the public sector based on the needs of the specific clients. So with this overall overview of the bank, how we are performing in terms of our lending portfolio. I'm just going to provide some data. It's a bit different from what Mr. Valdir presented before, because I think it's just more updated. This is based on the last financial report of the bank from the third quarter of this year. And then here you can see a breakdown of what we are doing now. In just 6 years of activities, we have provided more than 80 loans approved by July 22. Those loans amount for over $30 billion, of which $15 billion are already disbursed. A part of it, of course, for the emergency program that we provide for COVID, including that. Brazil responds to about 17% of the bank's portfolio. India and China are about 27% for each for the portfolio. Brazil is about 17, quite similar to South Africa, and Russia is a bit below now, including because Russia now has no new operations due to the conflictive situation, the sanctions imposed, and the decisions that the board of directors of the bank has taken regarding the Russian situation. So, in that portfolio, you can see here by area of operation, that's important, that if you take the emergency program for COVID, that represents 31% of the bank portfolio of approved loans, the sector that has the highest participation in the bank portfolio is transportation. So 23% of our lending portfolio is on transportation. That shows the importance of this sector for the development of those countries. And we have operation transportation in all of the 5 member countries. And for sure, in the very near future, as we have new members, we have Bangladesh, we have Egypt, we may have Uruguay very soon join the bank effectively. Transportation is going to be a demand for all these countries. And transportation here means either for road, rail, airports, navigation, ports, terminal, but also for urban mobility, as well as together with urban mobility, non-motorized urban mobility or greener solution for transportation, together with traditional solutions for transportation. But that shows the importance that the BRICS country has for this sector. As I mentioned, if we are the demand-driven bank and the transportation sector has the highest portion of our portfolio, demonstrates that the highest demand of the BRIC countries for financing is on transportation. So we are very aligned with that demand and the solutions we can provide. Taking the case of Brazil, of the most traditional infrastructure sectors, you may see that comparing to water sanitation, that has also a huge gap in Brazil to finance, but the needs for water and transportation are far lower than the needs for the transport sector in Brazil. Not only urban mobility, for the congestion of the cities, but also for logistics, and that has a very important impact on the productivity and the efficiency of the economy, as well as for trade. So for enabling trade infrastructure, enabling an increase in trade, that's also important aspect of the bank strategy. Transportation will be in Brazil, again, a key sector. And the demand investments for transportation in Brazil for the next 10 years has to multiply for 4. So in water, we have to multiply for 2, but in transportation, have to multiply for 4, showing the importance of these sector for the demand of the country, as well as for our portfolio. We also have here a breakdown of operations. Although we have a target in the new strategy that our overall lending portfolio should be 30% towards private sector operations, we are still below that. 87% of our operations are towards sovereign guaranteed operations, public sector, and 13% are in other solutions that are not public, not sovereign. But that might increase, particularly in 2 countries or 3 countries. I think that between the member countries, 3 countries has a very strong demand for private sector financing, and Russia. But Russia now has this issue. But South Africa and Brazil, which have very similar fiscal conditions and fiscal restrictions to public financing, private sector financing is a very important aspect for transportation, and I'm going to mention that a little bit before. Looking at Brazil, particularly, as we are discussing, mostly with Brazilian counterpart, but also with other countries, you have this data for every country. Here you can see the evolution of the bank portfolio in Brazil, with this very important increase in overall lending. 2020 was a very exceptional year, but this also is related to the COVID. We have 2 operations for the COVID with $2 billion in the country, but show that we are increasing our portfolio, consolidating the bank presence in Brazil. And now we have already approved $5.6 billion in projects in Brazil this year. Already approved $640 million in operations in water, in banking, in infrastructure for the agricultural sector. And also about 80% of our portfolio is public, and 20% is no sovereign. Brazil has the highest portion among the BRIC countries, the NDB, with no sovereign operations, followed by South Africa. Here we can see a list of our approved projects, and you see, Valdir, that we already had other projects on transportation, not only the investment in Carajás railway in the states of Pará and Maranhão, and together with the port, improving the port, but we also have investments in Curitiba, urban mobility, that's already being implemented, and through the Patria Fund, which we have an investment. We are also financing smart road transportation, as well as navigation. Navigation is, again, it's a very important issue for some of the big countries, for Brazil, for Russia, and for China. Navigation is a very important transport sector, and in case of Brazil, it's really underdeveloped, so that's why we're also investing in navigation. And then look at some of the urban projects we have that are integrated with development. They also involve investments in urban transportation. That can be to BRT, but also to cycleways or improving buses services, so far, so on. Then we go to the transport financing. And here these pictures just show the 2 models that you can finance from railway, from freight, to cycleways and urban parks. So these are also part of this broad transportation agenda in the country. But before going to our portfolio on transportation, I'd like to have this dialogue with the presentation made by Edpo from the World Bank. And not repeating what he already mentioned about the importance of the transport sector in the climate agenda worldwide. The transport is the second sector with the highest investment needs to reach the net zero by 2050. The whole world would need $42 trillion investments until 2050 to reach the target set by the Paris Agreement, as well as by the NDCs of every country, and also because this sector represents 4% of the global greenhouse gas emissions. But this varies a lot in every country. Brazil, for instance, in some countries, power are always the the highest emissions of GHG. Brazil is not power, is not transportation, but transportation in Brazil is the second. So it's also very important here. Asia is the region of the highest needs. Part of the graphic that was showing by Mr. Edpo of the increased emerging economy road transportation in regards to Asia. The fast-growing countries, the large populations in Asia, including three of our member countries, China, India, and Bangladesh. So also the heavy road transportation is a very important sector. Also, this is, in Brazil is even more important because a greater part of our logistics is based on trucks, on roads. But also urban transportation need a lot of investments because those emerging economies are becoming more urbanized. They become more urbanized, urban mobility is going to be a bigger challenge for not only for congestion, but for emissions reductions, for inclusiveness, and for sustainability of the cities. In the case of Brazil, transportation represents 8% of the greenhouse gas emissions, but which is the seventh biggest emitter in the sector. Brazil is the seventh emitter in transportation sector in the world. But although the participation of the emissions in Brazil in transportation is only 8%, the investment needs are huge. We are seeing about, only in Brazil, $800 billion estimated, which is about 40% of the total investment needs for Brazil to reach the net zero by 2050. So that shows the importance of the infrastructure investments for the transportation sector, for climate, but also this related to productivity, to efficiency, to sustainability altogether, and inclusiveness. So our portfolio, going towards what we're doing, we are doing a very large range of subsectors in our portfolio. In mobility, we're financing from metro to BRTs. And we do finance BRTs based still on diesel. Of course, in Brazil, we're going from Euro 5 to Euro 6. But some countries, they will not be able to electrify their bus system in the short run due to the financial and development conditions. We are financing urban mobility network improvements for existing infrastructure. We are financing normal transit transportation and multimodal terminals or multimodal integration of urban transportation in all the countries. In logistics, we are financing railways in Brazil, we are financing railways in India, financing railways in China and Russia, roads, airports, ports and navigation, particular ports in China, airports in China, ports in India, and navigation in Russia, and multimodal terminals in South Africa. So this is part of our lending portfolio on transportation. And going back to the strategy and how this relates to the long-term strategy of the bank with the demand of the country, how can we match a strategy with the demand-driven conception of the bank? So we are saying that for the next 4 years, 22 to 26, 40% of the bank lending portfolio should contribute to climate change mitigation, adaptation, and resilience, including energy transition. That's for some of our member countries are the biggest challenge, like energy is a biggest challenge for China, for Russia, as well as for India. All the big countries, they have their own determined contributions to the climate change agenda, and we are going to align our lending portfolio in every country with the local targets. So we are not, and these together should compound the 40% target of the bank. So we're not going to finance 40% to every country. 40% is for the overall portfolio, which could vary in every country on the percentage of the lending portfolio on climate change action. Brazil maybe have higher than 40% portfolio, or the country can be lower than 40%, but overall, because we are going to match the strategy of the bank with the demands and NDCs of every country. In the case of transportation, our strategies say that we are support the increment, the augmentation of the intercity and intracity transport networks, particularly for these fast-growing economies and for the fast urbanization of our member countries, as well as it's a very important infrastructure that promotes regional connectivity and facilitates movement of people, goods, and services. So transportation is a key for the flow of the people, flow of the economy in the world, as well as in every country. So that's why transportation is going to be a key sector among the sectors that we are prioritizing in our strategy. We are also going to pay special attention and inclusiveness. So how transportation can be inclusive. If you look at urban mobility, it's very, very easy to identify the impact on good urban mobility that has a very huge impact on social communities and on inclusiveness, on gender equality, gender balance, so far, so on. So in every project, we have to do an assessment and also guide the clients towards the sustainability aspects, the inclusion, as well as together with the climate change impacts, either by mitigation or by adaptation, not imposing, but a result of a permanent dialogue. That's why we are customize every solution based on dialogue between the client needs and the bank presence to keep our demand strategy, our demand-driven and our strategy for every country and for every client. We also have some challenges that's going to end my presentation with a challenge that we may have. These may be more focused in Brazil. These challenges, maybe some of them are common to other countries, as well as South Africa, but maybe particular for Brazil. So I'd like you to consider that based on the Brazilian case, but also that could be extended to some of the other countries. As I mentioned before, not all solutions are going to be public. We really need everywhere to increase private sector participation and contribution to development challenge of every country of the world. And this is particularly important for the emerging countries in which governments are facing increasing fiscal constraints. Overall, for every sector, we have some constraints. The first one is long environmental permitting process. So this has to deal with sustainability, even using country systems. So this is a problem for the project. So we have to think planning is a key important aspect, and planning should consider that environmental permit takes a long time because impacts has to be correctly addressed and mitigated, and that takes time to do the correct assessment in every project. We have uneven regulatory capacity in every government. In the case of subnational governments, also in the difference between different states or municipalities, as well between countries. We have a very complex external accounting judicial system, depending on the country you are, depending on investment coming from for foreign investments. So this is an important aspect to be considered, the complexity of accounting, the complexity of the legal system that can attract or can be more difficult for external investor, but also for local investor. And in the case of NDB, you still have this issue of local currency lending. We are able to provide local currency lending already in China and South Africa, but we are not yet there for India, for Russia, or for Brazil, or for the new members. So in a sector in which revenues are mostly based in local currency, either for tariffs like toll roads or metro or buses or BRTs, or on freight that are all based, the revenues are based on local currency, our financing must match. And this is a challenge that NDB and other banks may have to develop local currency solutions to mitigate the foreign risk in long-term financing. For the sovereign part, when investments guided or driven by governments, we have increasing limited capacity for fiscal investments, fiscal restrictions. In Brazil, it's very clear, but it's not only Brazil, it's the same situation, for instance, for South Africa. We have large demand for several sectors that they compete for very scarce resources, the national budgets. In those countries which still have a lot of challenges in social infrastructure, on services, education, health, security, they all fight for the same limited resources. So the merit of every intervention in every sector is a very important aspect, but it's a very competitive environment for ring fencing resources to the transportation sector against other meritorious sectors, as I mentioned before. We also have public debt control mechanism that limits leverage capacity of state-owned companies. I think in the case of Brazil, state-owned companies, even if they have very large capacity to invest, but being state-owned, they are under the public sector borrowing legislation, and they limit the capacity to leverage. It reduces the investment capacity of public sector, including if they are independent state-owned companies under private law. And also have another problem that easier, in principle, is easier to respond. We don't have projects. When you do address a client in some of the countries, particularly in Brazil, the client don't have a detailed design project for investment. So the lack of projects, bankable projects, is also an issue for developing economies. We have to create the culture of long-term planning, but also to get long-term planning to develop a bankable set of projects. And going to the last part, on the non-sovereign private sector projects increasing demand, we have long period for project structuring that may take 2 years, maybe up to 4 or 5 years. So if you want to bring private sector to large transportation sector investments, you have to consider that the modeling of such transaction, and my colleague working in the IFC in the World Bank, he knows very well that this may not take less than 2 years from the start to the auction of a PPP or a concession. So I need also planning for private sector to build, to design, to go to the bid and to implement the project. Can be 4 or 5 years to that process. I have a large demand in Brazil for structuring of projects. So we need to increase the capacity of the member countries to prepare good private sector projects. Most of them are going through PPP or concessions, which require public sector to have the capacity to do the design, the modeling of such private sector interventions. We need, as addressed before by my previous colleagues, a clear and effective guarantee mechanism, not only for the public sector obligations in a concession PPP, but for climate aspects, for shocks, climate shocks, for external shocks, for demand shocks, for supply shocks. And this guarantee is still underdeveloped in our countries, and that's important to ensure that private sector investment will come. And when we do project finance, we also have to deal with another type of risks that should be covered by the project itself. So there's a more complex environment, but to have always to think about timing for that. And look at the challenge for overall challenge, the public sector, the private sector. We want to talk about planning. Planning is a key aspect and need long-term plan, because all these investments are long-term, to be prepared, to be designed, and to be implemented, and also to be financed. And finally, it's an increasing demand for our countries regional integration projects that add to the complexity that I mentioned before, the complexity of working 2 or 3 countries. When look at Uruguay is joining NDB. Of course, one of the demands in Uruguay is going to be integration between the Brazilian infrastructure with Uruguay infrastructure. This is going to be a bilateral program. So that will require a coordination between countries to design the similar regulatory framework that will be able to attract investment. So it's another challenge, but I think that's going to be an increasing demand for every country. We have this already in South Africa and Lesotho, for instance, regarding water. They have a project from Lesotho to bring water to South Africa. So regional integration is one of the key challenges for the emerging economies in the world. With this, I'd like to thank you all for your patience, for your attendance, and thank you again, USP, for the invitation for participating in this very important debate. And I'm open to receive any question you may have. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Abicalil. Thank you for showing us a more practical approach of the NDB. We are now, sadly, we won't have time for questions, but we're going to take note of all of the questions that were sent. And later on, we're going to send them via email to the panelists. Thank you again to all of the panelists for your time and availability and for your participation, and to all of our watchers as well. Thank you very much. And now we end the panel.
Thank you so much. It's been
Thank
a
you.
pleasure.
Bye-bye. It's a pleasure.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.